Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown, and this letter changed everything forever. A fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Father Brown finds a deadly letter. Father Brown opened the envelope addressed to a dead man, only to find a confession written in his own handwriting. For a moment, he simply stared. The study was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the faint groan of wind pressing against the rectory's shutters. The candle beside him flickered, threatening to extinguish, casting shadows that danced across the worn pages of the letter, now trembling in his hand. It was impossible. His eyes moved over the slant of the handwriting, the familiar curve of the letters. He had written this, but he hadn't. Not that he could recall. And the envelope, it was sealed with red wax, the kind he hadn't used in over a decade. The paper smelled of tobacco and mildew, but also something metallic. Blood, perhaps, or something trying very hard to pass for it. The name on the front stopped his heart. Reverend James McAllister. But McAllister was dead, buried in consecrated ground. Father Brown had presided over the funeral himself, said the final prayer over the closed coffin. That had been 2 years ago. Yet here, in his hands, was a letter dated yesterday. And the worst part, he recognized the phrasing. Not just the writing, but the phrasing. It was something he would write, something only he could write, but he hadn't. Had he? He unfolded the page with slow, deliberate care. The letter was short, just one paragraph, written with painful precision. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. The death of Jonathan Hall was no accident. The truth lies beneath the chapel floor. The one who knows is still alive." There was no signature, no initials, but the ink, fresh, still wet, as if written minutes ago. He turned his head slowly, scanning the room. No windows open, no doors unlocked, no signs of entry, and yet someone had delivered this letter. Not hours ago, not days ago. Now, Jonathan Hall. A name he had not spoken in nearly a year. The young man's death had been labeled a tragic accident, a fall from the bell tower during a storm. He had been repairing one of the weather-worn beams when the structure gave way. Father Brown had found peace with the verdict, even if it had never quite settled comfortably in his soul. There had been something in the boy's eyes, days before his death, a strange tension, a fear that he had masked with politeness, the kind of fear only the guilty or the hunted wear in secret. And now, this letter, this impossible, blood-scented letter. He stood slowly, the paper still in hand, and crossed to the far corner of the room. He tapped his cane gently along the floor as he walked. An old habit. Tap, step, tap, step. He stopped by the fireplace. The ashes were cold. No fire had been lit that evening. He glanced again at the envelope. No return address, no wax seal imprint. Just red wax, brutally simple, meant to look official. And the handwriting, though his, had an unease to it. A curve too sharp, a rhythm too rehearsed, as if copied. He left the rectory and stepped into the chapel, cane echoing with every step. The old wooden boards creaked beneath him, the cold biting through his coat as he reached the altar. the sixth board from the left. He knew this chapel like the back of his own hand. It was not something he'd needed to think about before, but now he knelt slowly, pressed his hand to the wood. Hollow, his fingers curled beneath the edge, lifting just slightly. Dust, old and undisturbed, gave way, and beneath the board, something pale. Bone, not large, finger-sized, and next to it, another letter, sealed, identical. But this time, it was addressed to him. He stared at the envelope, as though it might speak. His name, written again in his own hand. But this time, the seal was pressed. A small, unknown symbol, circular, like an Ouroboros. He hesitated, then broke it open. The message was shorter this time. The killer will confess before you arrive, but it won't be the truth. Don't trust the first to speak. That was it. Nothing more. Not a name, not a threat. Just a statement of certainty. As if the author was watching him even now. As if this had all been set in motion long before. A knock echoed from the chapel door. He stood, fingers clenched around the second letter. Rain began to tap against the stained glass windows, and the wind howled with sudden violence. The knock came again, this time louder. Father Brown crossed the room and opened the door. Michael Hall stood there, Jonathan's older brother. His eyes were hollow, clothes soaked, face pale. "I did it," he said. "I killed Jonathan." The words hung in the air, cold and deliberate. But they were wrong. Too soon. Too rehearsed. Father Brown did not respond immediately. He only studied the boy's face, the stillness of his body, the way his jaw clenched as though he had practiced the line 100 times. This was not grief. This was choreography, and the letter had warned him. Someone would confess, but not the truth. He brought Michael inside, gave him tea, listened to his story. The same version, repeated. They argued. Jonathan pushed first. Michael retaliated. A fall, an accident. But then he changed it, said he meant to push him, said he had hated his brother, said he had always been jealous. The inconsistencies grew thicker by the minute. His eyes darted every time Father Brown asked about the bell tower steps, and then finally, the boy said the one thing that made it clear. I remember the moment his body hit the floor, the sound it made. I'll never forget it." But Jonathan hadn't fallen to the floor. He had fallen from the bell tower. He had landed on stone outside, and Father Brown had been there, had seen it with his own eyes, had buried that memory deep. Michael could not have known that sound unless someone described it to him. He had been fed the story, prompted, led. Someone was using him. Father Brown excused himself, returned to the chapel alone. He walked the pews slowly, remembering Jonathan, remembering the weight in the boy's voice when he spoke about secrets and shadows before his death. "Someone's watching," he had whispered one night. "I feel them. I don't know who, but they know about the tower." The tower. He climbed it again now, slowly, painfully. The stairs groaned. Rain bled in through the cracks. At the top, everything was as it had been, except for a small slip of parchment wedged behind a cracked support beam. He pulled it free. A drawing. Rough, childlike, but unmistakable. It was the chapel, and next to it, 3 figures, one marked X, the second with a crown, and the third, Father Brown's own collar drawn clearly around the neck. His heart dropped. Someone had been watching, not just Jonathan, watching him. Below, thunder rolled, and in the distance, another knock, not at the chapel, at the rectory. He turned. There were now 3 letters on his desk, one addressed to Michael, one to Father Brown, and one with no name at all, sealed in blood, waxless, waiting. And as Father Brown stepped closer, a voice echoed in his mind, not spoken, not remembered, but suddenly there, undeniable. I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. He reached for the letter, and everything went dark. Chapter 2. The murder Father Brown predicted perfectly. He described the murder, where, when, and how, 2 days before it happened. And yet no one believed him, not even the victim. It began like a nightmare you don't remember waking up from, and Father Brown had felt the unease long before the blood was spilled. It came to him not as a vision or premonition, but in fragments, quiet details, offhand remarks, an unnatural stillness in the air. He never claimed to be a prophet, and yet, every time he walked into the Ormond estate, he felt the unmistakable weight of death settling before it had any right to. The Ormonds were a family of structure, order, and facades. Beneath the manicured lawns and silken dinner conversations were decades of repressed resentment, unspoken betrayal, and something else, something unnamed, but constant. The patriarch, Lord Desmond Ormond, had invited Father Brown for what he claimed was a spiritual cleansing of the manor. Nothing formal, he had said, just a priest's presence, a blessing, that sort of thing. But the request was made 3 days after a series of anonymous letters arrived at the estate, letters threatening not violence, but exposure. Father Brown never read them, but he saw how Lord Ormond folded the paper too carefully before hiding it in his vest. He saw the flicker in Lady Eleanor's eyes when her husband mentioned the phrase, sins of the past, and he saw the way their son Julian would vanish before every family dinner, returning only when the wine was poured and the arguments had begun. It wasn't just tension, it was choreography. Each member of the Ormond family was performing a version of themselves, and Father Brown saw it for what it was. A funeral rehearsal. He said it too, quietly to Lady Eleanor as she lit a candle in the chapel that had not been used in 30 years. Someone in this house will be dead by Sunday, he said, and the only mystery is whether they want it or deserve it. She laughed at the time, nervously, said he had always had a dramatic streak, and yet her hand trembled as she lit the flame. The next day, the body was found. Julian Ormond, dead in his father's study. The scene was too perfect. He was slumped over the desk, one hand still clutching a pen, the other resting near a half-empty glass of port. No signs of struggle, no open windows. The door had been locked from the inside. A single sheet of paper rested beneath his head. A suicide note. Short, cold, final. But there was a problem. It was dated tomorrow. Father Brown said nothing at first. He simply stared at the note, at the curve of the letters, the pressure of the ink, the way the glass of port had been placed, slightly off-center. He knew Julian, knew he was meticulous even when he drank, especially then. He turned to the others. No one spoke. Lady Eleanor wept, but only when someone entered the room. Lord Desmond paced too carefully, and in the shadows of the hallway, a housemaid named Bryony stood watching. Her eyes were dry, alert, almost hungry. The coroner arrived within the hour. Heart failure, he declared. Perhaps alcohol-induced, perhaps stress. Father Brown said nothing, but inside his mind, the scene was already wrong. Too many details added up to something unthinkable. The suicide note dated the wrong day. The wine glass, unblemished, no fingerprints, and the most peculiar thing of all, the pen Julian had been holding was out of ink. Why write a final note with a pen that doesn't write? He whispered to himself. The darkness around the Ormond estate grew heavier. That night, as the wind howled through the trees and the house settled into forced mourning, Father Brown sat alone in the chapel. The candle Lady Eleanor had lit now burned steadily, casting long shadows up the stone walls. He opened the drawer beneath the altar and found another letter, not addressed, not signed, but sealed with the Ormond family crest. Inside, a single sentence. "You were right, Father, but too late." He reread it 3 times. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar, and yet something about the ink, too precise, too careful, not Julian's, not rushed, not desperate, planned. That was the word Father Brown couldn't shake. The next morning, the whispers began. The staff spoke of voices behind closed doors, of footsteps where there should be none, of Lady Eleanor speaking to herself in the garden, of Lord Desmond burning something in the fireplace, long past midnight. But the most chilling rumor came from the butler, an older man named Carstairs. He claimed he saw Julian the night after he died, walking the upstairs corridor, whistling. Father Brown said nothing, but the wind outside grew colder. He visited the study once more, this time alone. He sat in Julian's chair, stared at the same desk. Everything had been cleaned, reordered, sanitized, but not perfectly. In the drawer was a second glass of port, untouched. It hadn't been found during the initial inspection. It hadn't been logged. It had been hidden, as if waiting. He lifted it, sniffed it. Poison? Number salt. Why would someone pour salt into a second glass of port? And then he saw it. The stain on the rug, just beneath the chair. Water damage. From a pipe above? Number from below. Something had spilled, not once, twice. He checked the study's fireplace. Ashes. And among them, what remained of a torn photograph. Edges burnt, but still visible. Julian, younger, standing with a man whose face had been scorched away entirely. But in the corner, just visible, was the same family crest that had sealed the second letter. The man in the photo had been part of the Ormonds, but now he had been erased. Father Brown brought the photo to Lady Eleanor. She refused to look. Instead, she said, "Sometimes a family must choose which truths it can afford." He asked, "What truth did you bury, Madame?" Her eyes filled with tears she had clearly practiced, and she replied, "The kind that doesn't stay buried." Then came the first real reveal. Carstairs was found unconscious in the wine cellar, struck from behind. No signs of a break-in, nothing stolen. But his pocket watch, his father's, had been taken. Why? Because it had been witness to something. A gift Julian had given him 2 weeks ago, one engraved with the words, "Midnight Knows." What did that mean? Father Brown remembered now. Julian had once told him, "If something ever happens to me, midnight will be the moment you understand why." Father Brown checked the study's grandfather clock. Midnight. The hands were stopped. Not naturally. Smashed. The gears inside were bent. Deliberately. Someone had forced the clock to freeze time, as if to delay it, or control it. He returned to the chapel. The candle was out, but on the altar, a chess piece, a bishop, painted red, blood red. Father Brown clutched it in his hand. He had seen this before, in the Ormond archives, a secret family code, a warning. Bishop read, "The lie is holy." He now knew that Julian's death wasn't a simple murder. It wasn't even about Julian. It was about silencing something he knew, something he was ready to say. and someone in the house, perhaps more than one, was willing to kill to stop it. But then Father Brown found the final item, a locket, left in the pew where Lady Eleanor had sat. Inside, 2 locks of hair, one Julian's, the other his twin brother's. Julian never had a twin, or so the world believed. So who had walked the halls after his death? Who had placed the second glass of port? Who had written the letter Father Brown had found? The questions circled, maddening, heavy, terrifying. And the worst part? He knew who it was. He knew who had committed the murder before it happened, because they had told him, whispered it in confession. And now, by the seal of his vows, he could never reveal the truth. Not to the police, not to the Ormonds, not to anyone, not even to God. The murder Father Brown predicted perfectly was the one he could never solve. And, as he stepped into the rain-soaked courtyard, thunder rolling across the moors, he whispered to no one, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And somewhere, behind the high windows of the Ormond estate, someone watched him and smiled. Chapter 3. Father Brown's Friend Turns Killer. He handed Father Brown the murder weapon, still warm, still stained, and said with tears in his eyes, "I had no choice." At first, Father Brown thought it was a cruel dream. He stared down at the blood-slicked revolver lying in his open palm, feeling the weight not of the metal, but of betrayal. Outside, the bell tower tolled midnight, and the rain turned the courtyard into a mirror of darkness. The dead man lay just 20 paces away, his face twisted not in fear, but in disbelief, as though even he couldn't believe who had pulled the trigger. The killer stood quietly before him, his oldest friend, the man who had once carried Father Brown out of enemy fire during the war, the man who had stood as godfather to his niece, the man who had sworn, once, long ago, to never raise a weapon again. Inspector Alric Fenwood, one of the finest minds in the region, a seeker of justice, a solver of puzzles, a man whose very presence could steady the most frayed of nerves. And now, a killer. But it didn't make sense. Alric had always operated on principle. He believed in the law. Sometimes even more than Father Brown believed in forgiveness. For him to commit murder, something deeper had to be at work. Something far more dangerous than rage or revenge. Something that reached back years. The body on the ground belonged to Cyril Ainsworth, a retired barrister with a reputation for cruelty dressed as cleverness. He had survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 public scandals, and 1 very public breakdown. He had made enemies in every corner of the country. But tonight, he was supposed to be a guest. He had come to Kembleford for the reading of an old will, a family affair, nothing more, or so everyone thought, until the shot rang out, echoing through the old stone corridors of the manor, until Inspector Fenwood, gun in hand, had burst into the chapel, demanding to speak with Father Brown, not the police, not his superiors, not even the victim's family, only Father Brown, because somewhere, buried in the silence between them, was a secret that had never truly died. "Tell me it wasn't murder," Father Brown had whispered, and Alric had simply replied, "I don't know any more." The investigation officially began within the hour, but unofficially, Father Brown had already begun pulling threads. Something about Alric's voice, the way it cracked when he said the victim's name, told him that this was not a moment of madness. This was the culmination of something long buried, Cyril Ainsworth had not been invited to the will reading. That was the first thing Father Brown discovered. He had arrived unannounced, unwelcomed, and unashamed, and yet no one had dared turn him away. His presence changed the atmosphere in the manor instantly, like sulfur in holy water. People lowered their voices. Guests stayed in their rooms. A maid claimed she saw him tearing pages from a book in the study fireplace. Another said she heard him whispering into the broken phone receiver. The second detail was even stranger. Ainsworth had told the butler that he wasn't staying the night, that someone would come for him before dawn. But no one ever came, except death. Father Brown searched Ainsworth's room. He found almost nothing. No luggage, no change of clothes, no toothbrush. But there was a letter, one sentence, scribbled on the hotel's stationery. "If I die tonight, he'll know why." The paper was unsigned, but the pen next to it, engraved with the initials AF. Was it planted, or was it the truth? Father Brown asked Alric about it the next day. They sat across from each other in the rectory. The air between them was heavy, like a tomb full of breathless saints. Alric didn't lie, but he didn't speak either. He only said, "You remember Vienna, don't you?" Father Brown did. It was 30 years ago. A case that had never been solved. A bombing in a courthouse, a child killed, and one suspect, Cyril Ainsworth, who had walked away clean due to insufficient evidence. The press had moved on. The public had forgotten. But Alric hadn't. And neither had the father of that child, a judge, a friend of Ainsworth, a man who died penniless and drunk, whispering Cyril's name as his final breath. There were threads, too many, wound together like a noose. Then came the first reveal. The will reading had been altered. Days before the gathering, a new clause was added, naming Ainsworth as the executor of the estate. A strange choice, since he had no legal ties to the family. But it was legally binding, and in that clause was a stipulation. All secrets tied to the original owner must be destroyed. What secrets? What was Ainsworth trying to erase? That question led Father Brown to the study. There, behind a false panel in the bookshelf, he found a set of old court documents, burned along the edges. But one name was still legible: Elena Fenwood, Alric's sister, dead 29 years ago. She had been accused of theft, publicly disgraced, and then suddenly gone. The official report claimed she took her own life, but Father Brown had always suspected otherwise. And now, in these papers, was something chilling. A statement from Cyril Ainsworth, sworn, signed, dated the same day Eleanor vanished. Father Brown brought it to Alric. He didn't deny it, but he said nothing about what it meant. Instead, he asked, "Do you believe in evil, Father?" Father Brown replied, "No, but I believe in rot." And Alric said, "Then you know what happens when you let it fester." The truth began to unravel faster than Father Brown could contain it. Ainsworth hadn't come for the will. He had come for leverage. He had come to silence something, someone. A guest at the manor, a young woman named Clara, confessed that Ainsworth had threatened her father, demanded payment, promised he would release a letter that would ruin the entire family name if she didn't comply. Clara's father was dead, but the letter? Gone. And that's when Father Brown saw it. The pattern, the confessions, the lies, the broken families. Every person at the manor had been touched by Ainsworth's poison at some point. Every one of them had a reason to want him dead, but only one had access to the revolver. Only one had once sworn to uphold justice at all costs. The The question was not who killed Cyril Ainsworth. The question was why the killer handed the gun to Father Brown, why Alric Fenwood had confessed so quickly, too quickly. It wasn't guilt. It was cover. Father Brown's mind reeled. Had Alric truly pulled the trigger, or had he taken the fall for someone else? Someone he had loved, someone he had lost. He returned to the chapel, and there, beneath the altar, was a box, wooden, locked. But the key was simple. It was trust. Inside, letters, from Eleanor to Alric. For years after her death, she had not died. She had run, and Ainsworth had known. He had found her, threatened her, blackmailed her. Alric had discovered this just days before the gathering, but he had sworn to keep it secret until Ainsworth showed up and made his final move. So now, the final question remained. Had Alric killed Cyril to protect his sister, or to finally bury the past? Father Brown stood over the grave that night. He held the revolver, he held the letters, and he whispered the only thing that made sense anymore. I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. And in the trees, beyond the cemetery, someone watched him, still alive, still hiding, and still willing to kill. Chapter 4. The letter that doomed everything. The letter arrived 3 days after the man who wrote it was buried, and by the time Father Brown opened it, 2 more people were dead. It was the kind of envelope that made the air colder, pale, frayed at the edges, sealed with a wax crest that hadn't been used in over 50 years, a serpent devouring its own tail. It smelled faintly of lavender, ink, and old secrets. Father Brown stood in the center of the rectory, rain lashing the windows, the fire behind him burning low, and stared at the letter as if it had claws. It had no return address, no date, just a name on the front, scrawled in a sharp, decisive hand. Father Brown. Nothing more. The handwriting belonged to Benedict Morden, the local historian. Found dead the week before, slumped over his writing desk with a pen in one hand and a single chess piece in the other. A white queen. His death had been ruled a stroke. No foul play. Nothing suspicious. Until now. Father Brown slit the wax and unfolded the letter with fingers far steadier than his heart. The message inside was brief, only 6 sentences, and yet it would become the match that burned everything to the ground. If this reaches you, I am already gone. The thing we buried was never truly hidden. The wrong person found it. I fear you know who. What comes next will be swift and deserved. No signature, no postmark, just the icy echo of truth that couldn't be taken back. Father Brown reread it. Once, twice. By the 3rd reading, he noticed something he hadn't before, the indentation beneath the ink. Morden had written it quickly, furiously, not with fear, but with purpose. A final act, a warning, or a confession. He had to know more. He visited Morden's home that same evening. The study remained untouched, sealed by request of his estranged daughter, Evelyn, a quiet woman with distant eyes and a voice that never quite found its volume. She met Father Brown at the door, wrapped in mourning black, and said, only he didn't deserve peace. Inside, the room was as it had been on the night of Benedict's death. Bookshelves towering to the ceiling, every inch filled with volumes on forgotten monarchies, medieval weaponry, and conspiracies buried under centuries of dust. The desk was clean, but something felt staged, too clean, too exact. Father Brown ran his hand over the desktop. No ink stains, no blotter, no notes, except one thing. The White Queen, still there, still clenched in the cold fingers, memory. Why a chess piece? Why a queen? And why that phrase, the wrong person found it? What was it, he asked Evelyn, but she only said this. My father once told me that the deadliest truths are the ones no one believes, until it's too late. 2 days later, the second death occurred. The groundskeeper at Morden's estate, Jacob Prynne, was found in the chapel, throat slit from ear to ear, blood soaking the pews. The church doors had been locked from the inside. No weapon found, no footprints, just Jacob, just silence, and beside his body, a black pawn. Father Brown's stomach sank. It was not just a symbol, it was a game. Someone was playing, and the next move would be checkmate. But who? He turned to the archives. Morden's personal collection held more than just dusty tomes. It held secrets, whole binders filled with handwritten letters, many never opened, correspondence from anonymous sources, maps, diagrams. One folder, labeled only with the year 1872, had been torn down, the middle, half of it missing, the half that mattered. But there, on the back of one old letter, in faint pencil, a drawing. The chapel floor, beneath it, a tunnel, a passage, sealed off long ago after a supposed flood. But Father Brown knew better. He returned to the church at midnight, alone. He found the trap door behind the altar. It creaked open like the breath of the dead. The passage below was damp, filled with cobwebs and the smell of ancient stone. His lantern flickered, the light bent. And, at the far end, he found it. A second letter. This one burned at the edges, half disintegrated from moisture. But the writing, still legible. To whomever finds this, I am not the first, but I may be the last. If Evelyn ever learns the truth, she will not stop. She will finish what I could not. Forgive her, forgive us all. Signed, Benedict. Father Brown froze. Evelyn. Evelyn was the one he feared. But why? What had she found? Or what had she been told? The third death followed the next. Morning. Mildred Deacon, the librarian, found in her home, drowned in her own bathtub, doors locked, windows latched, no sign of struggle, except one, a chessboard set on her kitchen table, every piece in place, except for the knight, missing. Father Brown returned to the chapel. He found Evelyn there, standing alone in the pews, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. 3 deaths, he said gently. 3 pieces. She looked at him and said, My father made me promise not to. Stop. He stepped closer. What did you find? A letter, she whispered. Older than him, older than the house, written by someone who was never meant to live, let alone tell their story. She reached into her coat and pulled out the letter, the one Morden had died protecting, the one that started it all. The parchment was brittle, browned by age, but the ink was clear. It was addressed not to a person, but to a nation, a confession, a claim that an entire bloodline of power had been forged on, a lie. That the Ormond family, aristocrats, patrons, lawmakers, had silenced a bastard child whose blood was just as royal and far more dangerous. It had been written by a man who had lived in shadow, who had fathered a child he could never name, and who had died with a promise unfulfilled. One day, the truth will burn this house down. Father Brown understood. Morden had discovered it. Jacob had helped him hide it. Mildred had traced its genealogy. And Evelyn had inherited its burden. Do you want justice? Father Brown asked. No, she said. I want the lie to die. But people are dying for it. She looked him straight in the eye. And they should. He knew then. He knew everything. He knew who wrote the first letter and why. He knew who left the chess pieces and where the knight was. He knew the next death. But he said nothing, because if he said it aloud, the game would end, and the truth, once spoken, could never be untold. He left the chapel in silence, returned to the rectory, sat in the dark, and waited for the final letter, the one addressed not to a person, but to him. It arrived at dawn. No stamp, no seal, just one sentence. You know what I am, and beneath it, a pawn, painted white. And from somewhere, far off in the woods behind the church, a fourth scream echoed into the morning. Father Brown did not flinch. He closed his eyes and whispered, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told, because this time it would doom everyone. Chapter 5. A Secret Father Brown buried. The body was buried 13 years ago, by Father Brown's own hand, in unmarked ground. Yet somehow it had returned, wearing a ring only he should have recognized. The grave was never supposed to be found. It was dug under cover of night, in a stretch of forest behind Kembleford that had long since been forgotten by man and map. Father Brown had stood over it alone, rosary clutched in shaking hands, whispering a prayer not of peace, but of silence. And, when the last of the soil had been replaced, he had walked away without looking back, carrying with him a secret so dangerous, so damning, that even the devil might have declined its weight. He told no one, not the bishop, not the police, not even his own soul in confession, until now. Now, 13 years later, a body had been discovered in the parish well, dressed in modern clothes, but with the same ring, an ornate signet, one of a kind, forged in Rome, blessed in sin. It was impossible. That body should not exist. Yet there it was. And when Father Brown saw it, when the constables lifted it from the black water and laid it gently onto the cobblestones, he turned to the wall, closed his eyes, and whispered the same phrase he had used the night he buried it. Lord, do not look. The case, as the police would say, was simple. A John Doe. No wallet, no ID. Estimated time of death, 12 hours prior. Cause, blunt force trauma to the skull, possibly from a fall, possibly from violence. But Father Brown knew better, because 13 years ago, that same skull had caved in the exact same way. And it wasn't a fall. It was murder. And worse. It was murder that had never happened. Back then, the man had come to him in pieces, bloody, hysterical, half-mad with fear. He had claimed someone was after him, someone who knew about the ledger, the name he dared not speak aloud. Father Brown had taken him in, given him shelter in the chapel crypt. And 2 days later, he vanished. That was the official story. But now, seeing the ring again, seeing the body with the face he had hoped to forget, Father Brown realized something devastating. He had buried a man who had not been dead. The secret wasn't just that he had concealed a body. It was that the body had still been breathing. The past clawed its way back with every moment. Names, dates, a ledger soaked in lies. He had locked it all away, hidden the documents, burned the rest. But someone had found something, and now the body had returned, not as a relic, but as a message. The constables asked questions. "Do you recognize him, Father?" He shook his head. They believed him. Why wouldn't they? He was Father Brown, and this was the most terrible thing of all. The closer a man lives to God, the more easily he is believed. So he investigated in silence, the only way he knew how. He began with the ring. It was too old to have been sold through any modern dealer. He had once seen a matching piece in the Vatican's archives, years ago, worn by a man with no name and far too much power. The symbol on the face, an open eye weeping a single tear, was said to represent an order that had died out centuries ago, a silent brotherhood tasked with hiding the sins of the church. But it hadn't died, and 13 years ago it had come to Kembleford. He went to the church attic, broke the lock on the old cabinet, pulled out the ledger. Not the real one. That was gone, burned, but a copy, incomplete, unlabeled, encrypted. The names inside were meaningless unless read backward, reflected in a mirror and lit by flame. And when he did, one name came clear: C. Albrecht. A priest, a ghost, a man who had vanished long before Father Brown's time. But not entirely, because the name also appeared on a letter he had once buried, a letter tucked inside the man's pocket the night he dug the grave. And that letter had ended with the words, "If I die, he rises." Who was he? And what had risen? Father Brown took the ring to Evelyn, the historian's daughter, the same woman who had nearly torn the village apart weeks before with her own revelations. She took one look and said, "This is not the original." "What do you mean?" "It's a copy," she said, "an exact replica. But the metal, this was forged recently, less than 6 months ago." "By whom?" She only said, "Someone who knew exactly what they were doing." It changed everything. The ring had not returned. It had been recreated, planted, to implicate, to unearth what should never have surfaced. Father Brown returned to the well. He looked down into the black water, into the cold, circular abyss where the body had been found, and saw another letter, floating there, untouched by rot. He pulled it out with his cane, unfolded it, and read 5 words. "It was never your secret." His heart dropped. The handwriting was familiar, his own, but the ink was new. So either someone had forged it, or Father Brown had written something he no longer remembered. The chapel bell rang once, and somewhere in the forest a voice whispered, not a ghost, not memory, a voice, real, alive, saying his name. 3 nights later, a second body appeared, at the edge of the woods, laid out beneath the statue of St. Jude, a nun, Sister Maria, her eyes wide open, mouth stuffed with pages torn from a hymnal, hands clasped around a rosary that did not belong to her, and on her chest, a ring, identical. This was no longer about a secret. This was a punishment, a game, a ritual. Father Brown stood in the rain and said aloud, "I know what I buried, but I don't know what I awakened." The pattern emerged slowly. The victims weren't chosen at random. Each had touched the original secret, however briefly. Jacob Prynne, the groundskeeper, had once moved the body under Father Brown's instruction. Sister Maria had been the last to see the man alive in the chapel. Even Evelyn's father, Benedict Morden, had hinted at it in a footnote from years ago. One by one, they were being silenced, which meant the last target was him. He returned to his room that night, found everything untouched, except the crucifix. It had been turned upside down. Behind it, another letter, the final one, just 3 words. "You buried me." And from the shadows of the hall behind him, a door creaked open. Father Brown did not move. He turned toward the dark and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And somewhere in the rectory, someone smiled. Chapter 6. This clue changes everything forever. The blood was dry, the door was locked, and the victim had no throat. but somehow he had written a name on the wall. Father Brown stood alone in the study of Rutherford Grange, his breath caught between disbelief and dread. The air was sharp with the copper sting of old blood, and the walls of the manor seemed to lean inward, like the house itself wanted to keep the truth from escaping. The names scrawled in jagged letters across the faded floral wallpaper wasn't the victim's, but Father Brown's. Brown. One word. A name. His name. Written in what could only have been the victim's own blood. But how? The man's throat had been severed cleanly, precisely, almost surgically. There was no way he could have spoken, let alone written. No prints, no weapon, no witnesses. And still, there was the clue. Impossible, disturbing, and utterly damning. For the first time in his long career, Father Brown had no idea whether the message was a cry for help or a warning. The mystery began days earlier, when the heir of the Rutherford estate, Charles Evermore, returned to the manor for the first time in 17 years. Officially, it was to settle family accounts. Unofficially, it was to face something that had driven him away. A family curse, whispered in the village, never spoken aloud. Charles had invited only 3 others, his sister Lillian, the family solicitor Mr. Kendrick, and an outsider no one expected, Father Brown. "I need someone who can see through lies," Charles had said when he appeared at the rectory unannounced. And more importantly, someone who knows how to keep a secret. Father Brown hadn't wanted to go, but something in Charles's voice, a trembling beneath the bravado, pulled him in. By the second night, the storm had moved in, heavy and merciless. The old manor groaned beneath the weight of rain and memory. Dinner was served in silence. Charles barely ate. Lillian never looked up. Kendrick drank too much. And Father Brown listened. He listened to the pacing above the ceiling, the whisper behind the library wall, the sound of a door closing when no one was near it. At midnight, a scream echoed through the house. By 12:03, Charles Evermore was dead, and by 12:06, Father Brown had found the clue, the name, written in blood, his name. "Someone wants me to find something," he whispered to himself, "or someone wants me to look away." The constables arrived by dawn, but their conclusions were swift and unsatisfying. They blamed it on Charles's fragile mind, perhaps an old rivalry finally erupting. Suicide, they said. Panic. But there was no knife, no weapon, no explanation for the name, the wound, or the locked door. Only silence and secrets. Father Brown knew Charles hadn't taken his own life. The wound was too clean. And Charles had made an appointment with the bishop for the following week. You don't plan reconciliation if you intend to die, which meant murder, which meant motive, but everyone had one. Lillian, the estranged sister, stood to inherit everything. She claimed she had no reason to harm him. But when Father Brown asked what she had done the night of the murder, she said, "I was asleep." He raised an eyebrow. Through the scream, she paused, then replied, "I didn't say it was restful sleep." Kendrick, the solicitor, had been seen in the hallway just before midnight. He denied it, of course, claimed he was in the cellar organizing papers, but his shoes were dry and the cellar floor was covered in an inch of rainwater from the leak. Father Brown took note of the lie, but not the liar, because the clue had changed everything. Brown. It couldn't be coincidence. Someone had lured him here, someone who knew his past. He returned to the study alone, stared at the dried blood, and said aloud, "What do you want me to remember?" And then he saw it. Not the name. The dots beside it. 3, faint, almost hidden beneath the smudged smear. 3 dots in a perfect triangle. And suddenly, he remembered. It wasn't a name. It was a signature. 13 years ago, in a village now wiped off the map by fire, Father Brown had come across a killer who marked each scene with the same symbol. 3 dots in a triangle. The case was never solved. The killer vanished. The last victim had been a priest, just like him. And now, the symbol was back. Which meant the killer was too. But why now? Why Charles? Unless Charles had found something. Father Brown began to search not for fingerprints or footprints, but for something older, something buried. In the back of the manor's library, beneath a loose floorboard, he found it. A box. Inside, letters, each dated in sequence, each addressed to Charles. But none had ever been sent. They were from a woman. Rebecca Albright, the governess, dismissed without cause in 1911, vanished thereafter. The letters told a story of a love affair, of a secret child, of betrayal, of blackmail, and of a final warning. If you choose your family over the truth, then you will curse them to death. Every letter ended with the same 3 dots. Father Brown's heart turned cold. Rebecca was the connection, and someone had used her name to set this plan in motion. He brought the letters to Lillian. She denied everything, said she barely remembered the woman, but her eyes betrayed her. They flicked, just once, toward the portrait in the hallway. Rebecca, young, stern, silent, painted in 1910, and in her lap, a child. Face turned, away. Charles. Number not Charles. The child's hair was too dark, the cheeks too soft. The child wasn't Charles. It was Lillian, which meant Rebecca had been her mother, not the family's governess, but a hidden mistress, a shameful secret buried beneath the Rutherford legacy, a secret Charles had uncovered and had paid for with his life. But then came the twist. Lillian hadn't killed him. Kendrick had, not for inheritance, but for love. He had loved Rebecca. She had chosen another. And when he found out Lillian was his daughter, he snapped. Years of guilt, rage, silence. And when Charles began asking questions, when he uncovered the affair and the truth of Lillian's parentage, Kendrick had seen the future unraveling. So he lured Father Brown into the trap, planted the signature, tried to bury the past with another death. But the clue, the dots, had changed everything. They weren't a warning. They were a memory. Father Brown confronted Kendrick in the chapel. He didn't run. He didn't deny it. He simply said, "I had no choice." Father Brown whispered, "We always do." But then, one final twist. One letter left in the fireplace, half-burned, unopened, unsent, from Rebecca, dated after her supposed disappearance, addressed not to Charles, not to Kendrick, but to Father Brown. If you're reading this, then I've failed to stop what's coming. You must bury this, Francis. You must bury the truth, or the past will bury you. It ended with the same symbol, 3 dots, and below them, 1. Final name, not Rebecca, not Kendrick, not Lillian. But someone Father Brown had forgotten entirely. His own brother, gone for decades, now suddenly, impossibly, tied to all of it. The clue had changed everything. And now Father Brown wasn't chasing a killer. He was chasing blood, his own. And in the distance, through the trees, a figure watched the manor from the hill, waiting, smiling, and holding a letter addressed to him. Father Brown turned away from the fire and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." because this time, the final clue was him. Chapter 7. Father Brown suspects the innocent. The moment Father Brown accused her, the room fell silent. Not because they believed him, but because they couldn't believe he believed it. It was a bitter January morning in Kembleford, the kind that turned breath to fog and suspicion to frost. The body of Lord Henry Ashcombe had been discovered in his study, a single bullet to the head, the pistol resting neatly in his right hand. The door was locked from the inside, the windows bolted, and the fire still smouldering in the grate. The coroner ruled it a suicide. The police agreed. The village mourned, but Father Brown saw something no one else did. A letter half burned in the fireplace, its edges singed, but the words still legible. "I know what you did. Meet me at midnight, or I go to the police." No signature, no address, just a threat. And so Father Brown began to question. Lady Ashcombe, the grieving widow, claimed ignorance. Their marriage had been strained, yes, but she insisted she knew nothing of any blackmail. Their son, Edward, was away at university. The staff had all been asleep. No one had seen or heard anything unusual, except for Miss Clara Bennet, the young governess. She had been with the family for 3 years, quiet and diligent, with a gentle demeanor that endeared her to everyone. She claimed to have been in her room all night, reading. But when Father Brown visited her quarters, he noticed a pair of muddy boots by the door and a damp cloak hanging by the fire. "It rained last night," he remarked. Clara nodded. "Yes, it did." "Did you go out?" She hesitated. "Just for a moment. I needed some air." "At midnight?" She looked away. "I couldn't sleep." Father Brown frowned. "Did you see anyone?" "No, Father." But he wasn't convinced. He began to dig into Clara's past. She had no family, no references before her employment with the Ashcombes. Her records were sparse, her history vague. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere. Then came the discovery that changed everything. A photograph hidden in Lord Ashcombe's desk drawer showing a younger Clara, arm in arm with a man who bore a striking resemblance to the deceased. On the back, a note: "To my dearest Clara, forever yours, Henry." Confronted with the evidence, Clara broke down. She confessed to the affair, to the promises made and broken, to the threats she had made in desperation. But she insisted she hadn't killed him. She had written the letter, yes, but when she arrived at the study, he was already dead. She panicked and fled. Father Brown wanted to believe her, but the evidence was damning. The letter, the photograph, the muddy boots, all pointed to her guilt. He informed the police, and Clara was arrested. But something didn't sit right. Father Brown revisited the study, examining every detail. He noticed the position of the pistol, the angle of the wound, the lack of gunpowder residue on Lord Ashcombe's hand. It didn't add up. He requested the coroner's report and found discrepancies. The time of death didn't match Clara's account. There were traces of another person's footprints outside the study window. Then came the confession. Edward Ashcombe returned home, and upon hearing of Clara's arrest, confessed to the murder. He had discovered the affair, confronted his father, and in a fit of rage, shot him. He staged the scene to look like a suicide and planted the letter to frame Clara. Father Brown was devastated. He had accused an innocent woman, allowed his judgment to be clouded by circumstantial evidence. He sought Clara's forgiveness, but the damage was done. Her reputation was ruined, her trust shattered. As Father Brown walked away from the Ashcombe estate, he whispered to himself, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 8. A confession Father Brown regrets hearing. He didn't cry, didn't tremble, didn't even whisper. But when the man said, "I killed someone you loved, Father," it was the only time Father Brown ever wished the confessional walls could bleed. The air in the chapel turned ice cold. The voice had been calm, almost eerily so, stripped of emotion but soaked in memory. It began like any other confession, veiled in anonymity and shadow. But what followed was unlike anything Father Brown had ever heard. The man described a murder, not a recent one, not something from the village rumor mill. He spoke of a death, long declared natural, sealed by time, and buried not just in earth, but in belief. The victim was Father Benedict Rowan, mentor, friend, almost a father to Father Brown. A man who had guided his faith, shaped his convictions, and died quietly one spring morning on a forest path. Everyone had believed it was a heart attack. There was no autopsy, no investigation. Why would there be? A beloved priest had simply passed away in the sunlight, or so it seemed. But now, in the suffocating silence of the confessional, someone claimed responsibility, calmly, confidently. He described the sound of the breath leaving Rowan's lungs, the way his hands twitched, the exact location, down to the crooked tree where Rowan used to pause and pray. And then, most disturbingly, the motive. Because you loved him more than me. That single sentence cracked something deep inside Father Brown. Whoever this was, he wasn't confessing out of guilt. He was confessing out of need, a hunger to be known, even in darkness. But he wouldn't say his name, wouldn't lift the veil, only said, "You'll know soon enough." And then he left, slipped out into the rain without a face, leaving Father Brown with the unbearable weight of knowing. For days afterward, Father Brown could hardly look at anyone the same. Who had been close enough to feel that jealousy? Who had stood beside him at the funeral? Who had offered comfort with one hand while hiding blood with the other? He remembered Rowan's final days now in painful detail. The way he had looked over his shoulder more than once. The strange conversation they never finished. The letter Rowan said he had written but never delivered. Father Brown searched his old books, his papers, everything. And there it was, a single page tucked behind a hymnal, a note in Rowan's handwriting. "He watches me too closely now. If anything happens, tell Francis I forgave him." It wasn't Francis who had betrayed him, but Francis was the one left behind, left with the knowledge, bound by the seal of confession. He couldn't speak the name, even when he finally pieced it together, even when he recognized the penitent's voice in a sermon the next Sunday, even when the man placed a calm hand on his shoulder after Mass and smiled like nothing had happened. Father Brown said nothing, but something in him had changed. Trust would never come easy, again. And as he lit a candle for Father Rowan that night, he whispered the only truth he was allowed to say aloud. "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 9. Father Brown follows a killer's trail. The killer sent the first clue directly to Father Brown's front door, a blood-stained map of Kembleford, with one location circled in red. The church bell tower where the last victim was found. Smiling. No one in the village knew what that smile meant. The body had been discovered at dawn, slumped against the tower's crumbling stone, neck twisted at an impossible angle, but with lips curled upward in a grin far too wide for death. It wasn't the expression that disturbed Father Brown. It was the intent behind it. Whoever had done this wanted the victim to be found, wanted to make a statement, and worse, they wanted him involved. The map had arrived without a return address, sealed in a plain envelope with only 3 words scribbled across the top. "You missed something." He opened it at the breakfast table, and when he saw the familiar outline of the village, his hand paused halfway to his cup. The red ink was smeared at the edges, thick, wet-looking, and as he leaned in closer, he saw a second circle marked in pencil just outside town, in the woods near the old train tunnel. He hadn't been there in years. He didn't eat that morning. By midday, the investigation had begun, but the police were already leaning on the easy explanation. Tragic accident. The tower's stairs were steep. The wind had been high the night before. But Father Brown knew the man who had died, Oliver Kent, a local schoolteacher, quiet, clever, and impossible to provoke. The idea that he had simply fallen didn't match the mark behind his ear, the tiny piece of cloth wedged beneath his fingernail, or the look of relief frozen on his face. There was something deeper, a message, a pattern, and someone had made sure Father Brown would find it. He followed the map. That same afternoon, he walked the long dirt path to the edge of Kembleford Wood, past the rusted railgate and through the overgrown field where the old train line used to run. The tunnel hadn't been used in decades. Children called it haunted. Adults pretended it didn't exist, but he knew better. And when he reached the mouth of the tunnel, he found it exactly as it had been drawn. A white feather, laid gently on the stones, not fallen from a bird, placed. He picked it up and noticed a number etched on the rock behind it. 21. A code, a clue. He didn't know, not yet. But when he returned to the village, he found something worse than answers. Another death. This time, a woman, Elsa Morland, librarian, known for her quiet devotion and fierce privacy. She had been found in the reading room, collapsed, book still open, glasses askew. But what made Father Brown's breath catch was the bookmark left behind in her hand. Not paper, not cloth. It was a second feather, black this time, and beneath it, the number 22. Now it was undeniable. This wasn't random. This was staged, and someone was leaving a count. But counting toward what? Or counting down? He began retracing the victim's steps, patterns, habits, associations. Both had lived on opposite ends of the village. No overlap in their social lives, no common events, except one. Both had, within the last 2 weeks, delivered a donation to the church. Small ones, unremarkable, but logged, as always, by Father Brown himself. And both donations came with a note. He found them again, tucked beneath stacks of old alms receipts. Each had only 3 words. From Oliver, "Forgive my delay." From Elsa, "Forgive what's hidden." They hadn't been just offering money, they had been offering guilt. But for what? Father Brown dug deeper into their records, their pasts, their families, and there it was, a third name. Thomas Wells, a carpenter, died in a barn fire 4 years ago. Accident, they'd said. But the fire had started at the back, away from the tools, and both Oliver and Elsa had signed the inquest report as witnesses. Father Brown remembered now. Thomas had once come to him, asking for help. He'd said he was being followed, that someone had learned what he knew, but he wouldn't say what that was. He'd left abruptly, paranoid, trembling. 3 weeks later, he was dead, and now so were the 2 people who may have helped cover it up. Father Brown was no longer just on a trail. He was being led, and the killer knew everything. He returned to the tunnel. This time, he found more than a feather. There was a box. Inside it, a newspaper clipping from the day Thomas Wells died. And behind it, a photo of 6 people standing in front of a school, all smiling, all alive. Except now, 3 were dead, and Father Brown was in the photo. The 3rd feather came 2 days later, pinned to the church's front door with a rusted nail. This one was red, and the number 23. He didn't know what it meant. Not yet, but he knew the photo was a hit list. He tracked down the remaining 2 people in the image. One had already fled, left the country, no forwarding address. The other, a woman named Margaret Hill, now married under a different name, lived just 2 towns over. He visited her under the guise of an old friend. She seemed nervous from the moment he stepped inside. Her hands never stopped shaking. She said she hadn't thought of Thomas Wells in years. But when he asked her what she remembered most about that day, her voice cracked. "He screamed," she said, "before the flames. I still hear it." Father Brown asked, "What was he screaming?" She whispered, "Not my fault." He left her house with a sinking heart, because everything pointed to a single, horrifying truth. Whoever had killed Thomas Wells hadn't been the only one responsible. They had all played a part, through silence, through omission, through fear, and someone was making them pay for it, one by one. And the trail ended with him. That night, he found a final feather, pinned to his own door. White, black, red, and now grey. The number on this one, 24, and next to it, not a note, not a photo, a mirror. His own reflection staring back at him, beneath the word carved into the glass. Final. He knew what it meant. He was the last. He had always been the last. Because he had done nothing when Thomas Wells came for help. Because silence, too, can be a sin. The trail had never been about catching a killer. It had been about confronting what was buried. And as he sat alone in his chapel, candlelight flickering, the door creaked open. A shadow entered. Not a stranger. Someone he recognized. Someone he once called friend. And the voice said only, "You remember now, don't you?" Father Brown didn't reply. He didn't need to, because some truths are heavier than justice. And as the candle snuffed out, he whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 10. The one clue everyone missed. Everyone had walked past the torn lace curtain, but Father Brown realized too late that it was the only clue that would have stopped the second murder. The first death was already too clean, too rehearsed. A woman named Violet Harrow, quiet, meticulous, respected, found lifeless in her garden at precisely 6:06 a.m., her hands folded, a teacup unbroken beside her, and a fresh newspaper laid neatly on her lap. There was no sign of struggle, no poison, no wound. But the face was contorted, not in pain, but in recognition, as though she'd seen someone just before dying, someone familiar. The constable had called it heart failure. The doctor had agreed. Father Brown didn't. He knew Violet. She was 49, healthy, disciplined, a former governess, a devout woman, the kind who measured her tea leaves with scales, and she never read the paper. She'd told him so herself. "Too many lies for my blood pressure, Father." So who put it there? Who placed the newspaper on her lap? And why? The garden held no answers. The house, tidy as a museum, was silent, untouched. Everything exactly where it belonged, except for one thing: the lace curtain above the kitchen sink, torn, frayed at the edge, not slashed, but unraveled. Father Brown noticed it as soon as he entered. He even paused, considered it, but the rest of the room was so immaculate, so precise, that he dismissed it. Everyone did. He would come to regret that. 3 days later, the second body was found. A man, Gilbert Marr, retired military, known for his memory and silence, found seated at his desk, head resting against a journal, dead before sunrise, no marks, no violence, and the same things again, a folded newspaper, a teacup, still warm, and a piece of lace in the trash bin. That was the moment Father Brown realized this wasn't murder in the traditional sense. This was a message, a conversation with the dead. But what was being said? He returned to Violet's house. Spent hours there. Touched nothing. Simply listened. The wind tapped the window. The floor moaned under its age. And as the shadows moved across the old oak floor, he finally saw it. The sunlight passed through the torn curtain at an angle, illuminating the opposite wall, and just for a second, the shape of a word appeared in shadow. Clara. He stepped back, blinded the light with his hand. The word vanished. A coincidence? He tried again. The pattern of the lace, torn precisely where the stitching failed, cast letters when sunlight passed through at a precise time. Clara. A name. He didn't know anyone named Clara connected to Violet. But when he pulled the record of her last will, he found a detail no one had mentioned. Her mother's name, Clara Elmsworth, died in 1961, in an asylum. No known children, except Violet's birth certificate was missing from the local registry, replaced by a baptismal note. No birth record, no father listed. Just the priest's signature and a small smudged stamp. One Father Brown recognized. It came from St. Jonathan's Parish, burned down 30 years ago, a fire that started in the confessional, and one of the only survivors, Gilbert Marr, the second victim. Father Brown sat in the dark for hours that night. The curtain, the name, the link between the victims. Two people with quiet pasts. Lives unremarkable in appearance, but tied to something older, something buried. He visited the archives, dug deep, found a case from 1954. A nun. Sister, Margaret, missing. Last seen at St. Jonathan's, never found. Whispers of scandal. A child, perhaps, and a priest. Transferred out of the parish under mysterious circumstances. The trail led him back to Violet. Her journals, hidden beneath the floorboard, revealed everything, not in facts, but in guilt. She wrote about the other room, a place in the mind, a place she visited whenever she heard Clara's name, a place where the truth was kept locked so deep she forgot it was even hers. And there was something else, a drawing of lace, exactly the same pattern as her curtain. Beside it, the word, "Remind me." Father Brown returned to Gilbert's home, searched the bin where the lace had been discarded, found a corner unburned, and this one said, "Forgive me." A lace code, a fabric confession, one only the victims could decode. But someone else had read it first, and that someone had decided it wasn't enough, because on the 6th day there was a third body, Margaret Doyle, daughter of a groundskeeper. She had lived on the edge of town, quiet, wrote poetry, collected antique fabrics, and left behind no notes except a full curtain folded beside her bed, unmarked, except this time stitched across the hem in invisible thread. You never told me. Now it was clear. The killer wasn't just punishing the guilty. They were recreating a past, rebuilding a forgotten story, through deaths designed as parables. Father Brown gathered the pieces, read the clues not as evidence, but as a Narrative: 3 deaths, 3 names, 1 buried truth. Clara Elmsworth had not died in 1961. She had escaped the asylum, lived under another name, perhaps even become a nun, perhaps a mother. But someone found out, and someone made her disappear again. The only question was, who knew? Who kept the secret? And who tried to forget? Father Brown had nearly found the answer, but the one clue everyone missed, the torn curtain, was never just a curtain. It was a diary, a prayer, a cry. And when he returned to Violet's house one final time, he looked behind the curtain rod. There, carved into the wood, barely visible. She was my daughter. Initials below it, G.M. Gilbert Marr. Not just a soldier, not just a witness, a father, a man who had kept the secret and then died for it. The killer had never intended to hide. They wanted Father Brown to see it all, to follow, to understand. Because only then, when he stood at Clara's old grave, unmarked, forgotten, did he see the last clue, the final curtain, hung on a wooden cross left fluttering in the cold wind, stitched in red. Now you know. Father Brown dropped to his knees, not in fear, not in guilt, but in mourning, because the truth had always been right there, written in sunlight and silence. And as he closed his eyes, he whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 11. Someone Father Brown trusted was lying. The letter arrived just before dawn, nailed to the chapel door with a silver nail, and all it said was, "One of them has lied to you every day for 3 years." Father Brown stood, with the fog coiling around his boots, staring at those 10 words. He didn't know who sent the message or why now, but he knew one thing immediately. This wasn't a riddle. It was a warning. And worse, it was true. The village of Kembleford was quiet that morning. Too quiet. The stillness was not peace. It was the kind of silence that arrives just before a scream. There had been no crime, no body, no emergency. But this letter turned everything upside down. It whispered a single, terrifying question into Father Brown's soul. Who had been lying to him, and why? Over the years, he had trusted many. Some earned, some misplaced, but none without prayer. There was Mrs. Macmillan, the devoted organist who never missed a Sunday. There was Inspector Mallory, too proud to pray, but still faithful in his own way. And of course, Brenda Hartwell, the parish secretary, his right hand, his protector, the one who knew the inner workings of the church better than he did. He went about his day as normal, or tried to, but every conversation now carried a different weight. Every smile, every glance, every hesitation. Father Brown saw them all through a different lens. Someone was hiding something. Someone had gotten close to him for a reason that had nothing to do with faith. By evening, the second letter arrived. This time, slipped beneath his door, in a different hand, a new ink. But the message, just as cutting. You already know. You just haven't admitted it. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the vestry, candlelight flickering, and made a list. A mental inventory of every moment in the last 3 years that had felt strange, slightly off. The missing offering envelope, the time the church safe was unlocked without a key, the misfiled baptismal records, small things until now. And then he remembered the Ashbridge case. A quiet woman named Emily Ashbridge had died last year in what seemed to be a simple fall down the stairs, a closed case, an accident. Father Brown had given her last rites, buried her himself. But something about that funeral had gnawed at him. It wasn't the body, it was the flowers. Roses. Fresh, white roses. Ordered from a florist in London. But Emily had no family, no friends, and no one ever admitted to sending them. The florist had claimed the order came from the church, but Father Brown had never made it, and the address given for delivery, it was the rectory, his address, his name, but his signature had been forged. He never found out who did it. Until now, he hadn't tried hard enough. He pulled the receipt from the filing cabinet. The handwriting was smooth, elegant, careful. And then he saw it. The same S-curve flourish, used by Brenda Hartwell, his own secretary, the one who had access to the church records, the one who had first found Emily Ashbridge's body, the one who had volunteered to call the coroner. The next day, he asked Brenda to join him in the chapel. She came, smiling as always, holding her notebook, ready for another mundane church task. Father Brown offered her tea, sat beside her in the front pew, and then asked softly, "Why did you order roses for Emily Ashbridge's funeral?" Her hand froze, just for a second. Not long, but long enough. "I didn't," she said. "That must be a mistake." "I checked the order," he said. "It was signed in my name. But the handwriting was yours." Silence. Brenda looked at him, not shocked, not confused, just calm, almost relieved. "You were never supposed to find that," she whispered. And then she confessed. Not to murder, not to theft, to something far worse, in Father Brown's eyes, manipulation. 3 years ago, she had come to the parish not just to work, but to watch. Emily Ashbridge had once been involved with a man Brenda had loved, a man who had vanished from her life, taken by what she believed was Emily's charm and lies. When she learned Emily had moved to Kembleford, she applied for the secretary job. Carefully, strategically, she planned to confront her, but she never got the chance. Emily's fall, she insisted, was an accident. She hadn't been there. She had nothing to do with the death itself. But afterward, after seeing the body, after seeing the opportunity, she decided to rewrite the ending. She sent the roses, forged the signature, made it look like a message from someone else, maybe even from God, to stir guilt, to stir fear, to twist the memory of Emily's final moment. It was cruel, it was cold, and it worked. Father Brown asked, "And the letters?" Brenda didn't answer, just smiled. "I only sent one," she said. "But I'm glad it made you look closer. You needed to." And then she walked out of the chapel, and never returned. Father Brown never turned her in. There was no crime to prove, just deception, just heartbreak. And as he stood alone in the empty nave that night, the candlelight trembling, he whispered to the still air, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 12. Father Brown's life hangs in balance. The bomb was hidden beneath the altar, and the killer had left a note that simply read, "Your faith won't save you this time." The chapel was quiet that morning. Too quiet. Father Brown noticed it before he even opened the doors. Birds that usually sang from the rooftop were silent. The wind, often a gentle murmur through the stone arches, was completely still. And when he stepped inside, his coat dusted in frost and the air sharp enough to pierce the lungs, he knew something was wrong. He always knew, but he didn't expect death to be waiting for him. For years, Father Brown had been the seeker, the listener, the one who pieced together the patterns others ignored. He had seen evil wear the face of kindness. He had forgiven monsters, prayed with murderers, and uncovered truths too dark to say aloud. But he never imagined that one of his cases One of the dozens he had solved would come back to finish what it started. It began with the letter, delivered by hand. No return address. Just one word on the envelope. Retribution. Inside, a photo. Old. Faded. Torn at the edge. 6 children standing outside an orphanage. Smiling. And in the background, a priest. One he recognized. Himself. But there was something else in the photo. A shadow in the window. A figure that should not have been there. And scrawled across the back in crimson ink. You missed one. He stared at the image for hours. The orphanage had burned down 21 years ago. An electrical fire, they said. 3 children died, but the others survived. One became a teacher. One vanished. One was found drowned 5 years later. And one never came forward again. He had never questioned it, until now. Now someone was questioning him, accusing him, holding him responsible for what they believed was more than an accident. The church was empty when the first candle exploded. Just a flicker, then a pop. Wax splattered against the floor. The smell of gunpowder lingered. Father Brown knelt, inspected the candle base. Wires, carefully concealed. Not meant to kill, not yet. A warning. He contacted Inspector Mallory, explained everything, except what he feared most, that whoever was behind this wasn't trying to kill indiscriminately. They were playing a game, and Father Brown was the prize. The next clue came in the form of a child's drawing, left on the pew where he always sat, drawn in charcoal, 6 stick figures, one circled in red, and underneath it, "We remember what you forgot." The figure circled, a priest, no face, just a cross on the chest. He looked again at the photo, then the drawing, then back at the candle debris. And the terrifying thought emerged. What if the fire hadn't been an accident? What if someone had survived and blamed him for letting it happen? He traced the orphanage's old files. Half were destroyed in the fire, but one name kept appearing in the margins. Caleb Rains. No record of adoption, no burial, just vanished. He remembered the boy faintly, withdrawn, artistic, brilliant, but strange. And the day before the fire, he had confessed something dark. He had said, "I hear voices at night." Father Brown had promised to talk to him again, but that conversation never happened because the fire came and the boy disappeared. Until now, until the wires in the candles, until the next message appeared, written on the back wall of the confessional. "You said you'd protect us." This was no longer a mystery. It was vengeance, personal, calculated, biblical. Then a discovery in the bell tower. A second bomb, much larger. Tucked inside the old rope well, disguised beneath the dust and gears, it was set on a timer. 3 days, no demands, no threats, just time ticking down. And a note attached. "This ends where it began." Father Brown returned to the orphanage ruins. Weeds had claimed the land. Stone walls collapsed. But the foundations remained. He walked the floor like a ghost, retracing steps. And in the old chapel wing, beneath a shattered beam, he found it, a leather satchel. Inside, drawings, pages and pages, each more disturbing than the last. One showed the church exploding. Another showed a figure kneeling in flames, hands clasped in prayer. And in the center of every image, the same face, his own. And then a final page, blank, except for a single sentence. "You have one chance left to tell the truth." He knew now, knew it wasn't about what had happened. It was about what he hadn't seen, about a boy who had cried out for help and been left unheard. And now, that boy had become a man, a ghost, a murderer. Maybe, or maybe something worse, a judge. The night before the deadline, Father Brown stood alone in the sanctuary. He had sent everyone home, locked the doors, lit the candles himself. He waited. Not for police, not for salvation, but for Caleb. And Caleb came. At 11:59 p.m., he stepped from the shadows of the choir loft. Older now, but the eyes were the same. "Do you remember me?" Caleb asked. "I never forgot," Father Brown said softly. "You never looked," Caleb replied. And then silence. A bomb ticked somewhere in the walls. Father Brown didn't flinch. He simply asked, "What do you want?" Caleb walked forward. "Not justice," he said. "Not anymore." "What then?" "Understanding." He dropped the trigger on the altar. "You have 5 minutes to decide if you're ready to die, knowing the truth, or ready to live, telling it." Father Brown looked at the boy, the man, the soul he had once failed, and said nothing. He picked up the trigger, walked past him, and placed it in the baptismal font. Let it sink beneath the holy water. "I already died," he said, "the day I didn't listen to you." And Caleb, he wept, then vanished. Before morning, the bomb was gone, and so was the man. But the scars remained. And as Father Brown knelt before the altar that nearly became his tomb, he whispered what only he could understand. "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told."